So now a very regular guest of ours for the last 9 or 10 years, my friend Professor Stephen Kotkin. Welcome,
Hello, everyone.
Stephen. You're in Boston, and where just before you make your prepared comments, you've just heard from three of the world's largest asset owners from the UK, from Canada, and from France. Some fairly bleak comments from each of them in terms of where we're at in the world. Looking at the news again overnight, your country seems to be in more peril in lots of different ways, and certainly now the southern states are seeing some spikes with COVID-19, Texas, Florida, and elsewhere. How are you doing in Boston, and how are you feeling?
I'm protected because I'm in my wife's attic, and so I'm very insulated from all the trouble. But yes, there is big trouble, and we're still early, as you indicated. I thought the panels this morning were excellent, but overly on the optimistic side.
Well, we can rely on you for the pessimistic and perhaps the realistic version of events. Your topic today is geopolitical risks, uncertainty, and the COVID crisis. And I know you have some prepared comments, so over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, I'd just like to say that I very much miss the in-person interaction that Connexus excels at. The chit-chats at the breaks, the lunches, the dinners, all of that is deeply missed. But I'm very grateful that you've managed to still connect us, and I thank your tech people for a really amazing job here, all the time zones and participants. I'm going to touch on two very big themes. The first theme will be about whether the pandemic has actually changed geopolitical risk in any significant fashion. My preliminary answer is no. It has not changed geopolitical risk in any significant fashion. Of course, the death toll has been horrific, as you alluded to, nearly 500,000. There have been significant political consequences already, with more to come. The problem that troubles me the most, hundreds of millions, perhaps more than 1 billion children who are not in school, and unclear how we can return them to school. All of this is significant beyond words, but for our purposes, no fundamental change in the geopolitical risk outlook that we saw prior to the pandemic. So let me go through 5 megatrends to try to illustrate this point. This is a 30,000-foot view, as we say. Each trend has run its course. The theme here is about hitting a brick wall or ending up in a cul-de-sac. First, the Middle East. We had political Islamism introduced by the Iranian Revolution into power in 1979. It was a response to real issues, outside interventionism in the Middle East, a vacuum following the failures of Arab pan-nationalism, etc. But it has devolved into autocracy, political repression, foreign adventurism, stagnation, and despair. Islamism in power has hit a brick wall. It muddles through. It stays in power in Iran. We're not suggesting that it's toppling anytime soon, but there is no forward movement, and there's nothing on the horizon for forward movement. So that trend of political Islamism is a failure with no possibility of redemption that we can see on the horizon. Second mega trend is China. Deng Xiaoping's market Leninism was a very bold bet to retain and strengthen the Communist Party monopoly on power, but to experiment with market mechanisms in the economy, right? Market Leninism. This was a response to very real issues, mostly internal, Mao Zedong's misrule, the Cultural Revolution, chaos. It was a tremendous innovation at the time and has produced incredible results, breathtaking results, but it too has hit a brick wall. China is unable to move forward with political liberalization. because the Communist Party is an all or nothing proposition. It's a monopoly rule. When you liberalize a Communist Party, you begin unwittingly to liquidate the Communist Party rule. People don't want debate only within one party. They want political debate and pluralism of multiple parties. Every time the Communist Party anywhere has tried to open up, it has destroyed, liquidated itself. So they're stuck in China. They need to do deeper marketization. They need to do more accountability in the political system, but they cannot. They've hit a brick wall. This is extremely important megatrend. The third megatrend, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you. Sorry, Stephen, I just want to interrupt for a sec. I can hear you. I'm just asking, have you got before you go into your other megatrends, have you got a solution for China? Is there a solution?
We'll get to that at the end of the megatrends. I'll try to summarize, but you're exactly on point.
Okay.
What does it mean for going forward? A third is the United States and the United Kingdom. Here we had the Thatcher-Reagan synthesis of deregulation, denationalization, pro-market dynamism. Once again, a response to real issues, stagflation, crippling strikes, and various other trends, Watergate, the loss of the war in Vietnam. The Reagan-Thatcher synthesis was also highly dynamic, extremely far-reaching in its consequences. For example, it moved the left to the center. You had Blair, New Labor. You had Clinton, New Democrat. The Thatcher-Reagan synthesis was colossal in the Anglo-American sphere with global effects, as big or bigger than Deng Xiaoping in China. However, the Reagan-Thatcher synthesis has also stagnated and has also hit a brick wall. We're now in a cul-de-sac in the Anglo-American sphere, and phenomena like Trump or like Boris Johnson are symptoms rather than causes of the cul-de-sac that we're in. Megatrend number 4 is going to jump forward in time. The three that I've just mentioned, political Islamism being a failure, not a solution, China's market Leninism hitting a wall because of its contradictions, and the Reagan-Thatcher synthesis running out of steam because the problems it addressed are gone, and there are new problems now that it's not addressing. All of those date effectively from 1979 forward. There are also two other megatrends that date more from 1989 and the fall of communism, but they too have hit a brick wall. One is the European Union, which was also a response to history and to gigantic problems that history had thrown up. It was a solution in many ways to that historical record. But of course, the monetary union that was introduced in 1992 was not accompanied by fiscal union, and that contradiction was supposed to resolve itself over time. But despite all the achievements of the European Union, from some people's point of view, we are stuck. The European Union is stuck. This is not about Brexit. This is about the fact that there's an inherent contradiction that can't be fixed. We cannot move forward to fiscal union, but most people do not want to relinquish the monetary union. So the EU is also in a stagnant, can't move forward position. The fifth and final megatrend that I'd like to point out here is globalization itself, which was present before 1989, of course, but became accelerated or even hyper-globalization after 1989, 1991. What we see here, however, is that there is no global governance. There is integration, there is deep, profound global integration without effective mechanisms of global governance. We have global management of issues. For example, the WHO manages health. The ICC, the court, manages crime. UNHCR helps manage refugees. The WTO for trade. Many of these global institutions have been effective in their spheres. Others have been less effective. But they are management of single issues. And by the way, there is no global management of climate change. They have yet to introduce a WTO or a WHO equivalent. In any case, this is not global governance. The only global governance we actually have is a national bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which does most of the heavy lifting, like it or not, in terms of global governance. So we have a globally integrated world and a national currency and a national bank. This is like the EU problem, but on a much larger scale. And so all of these 5 megatrends predate the pandemic, and none of them have been solved by the pandemic, and there is no resolution on the horizon, pandemic or no pandemic. So if you're thinking about geopolitical risk in your portfolio, you have these 5 megatrends. They're not the only ones, but they're the biggest, and they interact with each other. And without a resolution of the megatrends, we're not going to see positive progress on all of the issues we'd like to see positive progress on. In fact, debt, the proliferation of debt in so many forms, right? Now it's more government debt, but it's also corporate debt. It's also private debt, right? This is a tremendous symptom of the depth of the crisis that we're in, which takes the form predominantly of stagnation, right? The EU is not falling apart. It's muddling through. Iran is not falling apart. The regime is muddling through. China is not falling apart. It's muddling through. But the muddling through is something we could be seeing for a long time, or it could get worse. Let me just say that Greg Jensen of Bridgewater pointed out that the current recourse to modern monetary theory is absolutely necessary, but it's also dangerous. So what does that tell you? That a policy that's necessary is dangerous tells you that something is amiss. You cannot fix a problem with more debt. And the inflation, which is the only solution to the debt problem, brings with it perverse and unintended consequences in other spheres. And so here we are. We want to retain the benefits of globalization. We want to retain the benefits of the EU. We want a US-China relationship that's functional rather than dysfunctional. However, you cannot do this without domestic solidarity. The problems that we face, globalization, don't work because domestic solidarity is frayed. You cannot be globally integrated when you're domestically fragmented. And so that's where the solutions must come. They're not going to come from global governance. They're only going to come from domestic solidarity and trust, which of course is free. The number one variable is good governance or its absence. We see this time and again, the same way when investors do their due diligence and look over an investment opportunity, a company or an enterprise. They always look at the governance practices, and they're always hesitant when there's no good governance or when there are questions of governance to put their money down. So that's where we are. Let's go to point number 2, the second point that I wanted to make. Also, a large 30,000-foot view. The decisive and unpriceable geopolitical risk, as I've been saying, like a broken record for many years now, is the confrontation between China and the US. This confrontation predates the pandemic, and it will post-date the pandemic if we're lucky enough to get on the other side of the pandemic. And it is a deeply alarming trend that affects all other trends. We're going to have 2 specialist panels coming up on China after I speak, so I'm not going to go into depth here. I'm just going to make a few points. The US-China clash is not a misunderstanding. It is not because we don't listen to each other, because we don't like each other. It is a fundamental clash of state interests and even deeper than state interests of values. The clash is real, the clash is permanent, and so the issue is not can we get around the clash, it's can we manage the differences? Can we manage the differences in state interests and values? People arguing about they're afraid we're going to enter into a new Cold War. I have to tell you, the new Cold War started quite some time ago, and it's permanent for the time being. And moreover, a Cold War is better than a hot war. A Cold War is actually a better solution and can be managed. The differences can be managed. The Chinese Communist regime is a nasty regime. It is a deadly combination of supreme arrogance and profound insecurity. We've seen it now. We've seen it now in action. But our problem is not the Chinese regime. The challenge here is China itself. If the Chinese communist regime were to implode or be overthrown, China would still be there. China would still be the colossal geopolitical fact that it is, and that we would have to manage because there are differences of state interest and values that have nothing to do with the nature of the regime. I should say two more points. China's own behavior has been self-defeating. It has galvanized a response against itself, accelerating divisions of the world. Accelerating divisions of the world into spheres of influence, into allegiances based on technology standards. Australia, Japan, India, EU are all galvanized by China's behavior. However, the US does not know what to do. The US is fumbling. The US's behavior is also self-defeating. We have a debate, if you can call it that, in the US, where one side wants to risk going to war, and the other side issues ridiculous platitudes about a win-win situation. Neither one of those is a realistic policy. We need instead to understand that China is not going away and that the differences need to be managed first by laying down deterrence again. That is to say, when certain behavior occurs, there's a price. And at the same time, by also engaging in robust diplomacy so that when there's good behavior or behavior that we prefer, there's reward. So this is nowhere in sight on the current landscape. It's not part of the Democratic Party establishment. I'm sorry to disappoint our friends globally, but there is no superior China policy currently in democratic circles compared to the one that we see under the current presidency. So to sum this up, the geopolitical megatrends of stagnation or hitting a brick wall are troublesome. They don't mean an outbreak of revolution or civil war in all places. There's a muddling through. However, the US-China relationship is what could blow up. And that could blow up all of the megatrends as well as the world. Why do I say this? I say this because the pandemic has taken 500,000 lives. And depending on how we manage going forward, that number could grow exponentially, which would be catastrophic. World War II, a hot war, not a Cold War, claimed 55 million lives globally. Several 100 million more were maimed or severely wounded. More than 100 million were homeless and refugees. That is not a world we want to live in. That's not an event we want to see. That is unfortunately the path that we are on right now in the confrontation between the US and China. And so I conclude now by saying I would like to see us avoid those kind of catastrophes and regain our mojo and dynamism and fix the stagnation with domestic solidarity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor Kotkin. I wish you'd put some thought into your presentation this time. That was outstanding. Look, before we've got lots of questions here. I'd like to go to one that's come in earlier that relates slightly. It's framed this way. How do you foresee the crisis in Hong Kong will play out? How will Western countries respond? Do you expect significant financial market turbulence driven by the politics at this financial hub? And given it's a very senior person in the machinery politically of Hong Kong that's asked that question, I'm not going to name who it is, but I'll leave you with that question, please.
Hong Kong is another fantastic achievement. It's breathtaking what Hong Kong was able to do over a long period of time because of itself. It managed to be the intermediary between the outside world and China and doesn't get sufficient credit for China's incredible rise. We give too much credit to the Communist Party in Beijing and not enough credit to Hong Kong, which of course managed most of the FDI that came from offshore into China. Moreover, Hong Kong is a model. It's a model of freedom and rule of law. And so that's also very important, but that's the problem for Beijing. Hong Kong is an alternative political and legal system, just like Taiwan. And so the Communist Party strangulation of Hong Kong is not an idiosyncrasy. It's not something personal, one ruler or another ruler. It is unfortunately a structural feature because the Communist Party is afraid of what Hong Kong represents as an alternative political model. Our goal on the outside should be not to punish Hong Kong, but to punish the Chinese Communist Party for its behavior vis-a-vis Hong Kong. In other words, we should not remove Hong Kong's status because that only plays into Beijing's game of strangulation. We should instead support Hong Kong. And unfortunately, so far, the policy has not been agile enough vis-a-vis Hong Kong. I'm worried for Hong Kong, but things are not over yet. The people there have been very courageous and will continue to be so, in my view. So we want to avoid pushing them to the other side.
Many questions for you here, Stephen, and only 11 minutes to go. The next question is, arrogance and insecurity is how you describe China. Is the US really any different? That's from they've given their name, but I might keep it confidential, but it's a chief investment officer of over $100 billion asset owner. Thoughts?
No one is more critical of the trends in the United States than I am. However, the United States has corrective mechanisms. We have a legal system. We have a judiciary. We have elections. We have markets. We have all sorts of corrective mechanisms, and there will be a correction coming up shortly. It won't be as deep a correction as outsiders are assuming, because there is a powerful trend of nativism in the United States on the right, and there is a powerful trend of anti-imperialism on the left, which is constricting left and right the U.S. behavior in the U.S. ability to engage internationally. But the U.S., for all its problems, for all its misbehavior, for all the grief that it causes, is not morally, politically, or legally equivalent with China, and U.S. can be fixed.
Yeah, but that wasn't the question, really. It wasn't questioning the institutions. It was questioning whether the terminology insecure and arrogant isn't also applicable to the US. Let's leave that as a rhetorical.
I admitted that at the beginning of the answer. I said that I'm no one's more of a critic of U.S. attitudes and behavior than I am. So that's fundamentally a correct view of how the U.S. has behaved. But it's not the only way that the U.S. can behave.
So let's change direction for a moment, and hopefully we'll come to some solutions if there are any at the end. Stephen, you've been a big fan of our earlier speaker, Professor Ian Golden. And in fact, I know that you like him and respect him, and you've commented in the past that you recommend his book, Butterfly Defect. Do you have some views on what he said this morning in regards to globalization or deglobalization?
It was a great presentation. There's no bigger expert. So it was fantastic to have him this morning. When Greg Jensen said that modern monetary theory is necessary and dangerous, Ian Golden said something very similar. What he said was that he's worried about the politics and the geopolitics, but globalization should still go forward because it's beneficial. It was a comment very parallel to what Greg was saying. Unfortunately, the politics and the geopolitics don't support the policy prescriptions that Professor Golden was recommending, right? The lack of domestic solidarity and trust is too much of an impediment right now to deeper global integration. And moreover, Asia is not going to work economically if it doesn't work politically and geopolitically. And so that is what he said, but the full implications of that, I would pull out more potentially. His view is that it should work, and my view is that it's not working, and I don't see it working on the horizon.
Now I'm going to go to a polling question of our investors and our audience globally, Stephen, and change direction slightly again. Slightly mischievous, but a very important polling question. The question is, who do you think, not who do you want, to win the election in the United States this November? We did think of putting in a third option in multiple choice, but we decided to keep it simple as option A, Donald Trump, and option B, Joe Biden. Of course, it could be a third for all sorts of reasons, but let's just go with those two. Who do you think, not who do you want, to win the election in the United States? And we'll keep that open for a few minutes and see what comes up. What's your answer to the question, Stephen?
We're still 4.5 months away. And so a lot can happen between now and Election Day, just as a lot has happened in the past few months. So I would just caution not to jump to conclusions yet. Trump campaign has not unloaded the full negative destruction of Biden's reputation. That's coming. We saw what happened to John Kerry, for example, when that happened. We saw what happened to Hillary Clinton when that was unloaded. So Biden will have to withstand the intense negative barrage fueled by big money. If he can withstand that, and there are no other big changes that unseat him, he could potentially win the election, but it's too early, and there's a pathway to re-election for Trump, as improbable as that seems.
So, Stephen, in the last week, according to President Trump, COVID-19 actually no longer exists in the United States. I'm sure that we'll see many different narratives being pushed, some real, some fake. This is a very important election outcome. What do you think will be on the other side of a Biden or a Trump win, or does it matter? Not matter?
The key in the U.S. normally is not solely the White House, but it's also the Senate. The United States political system is organized in such a way that the Senate either facilitates or blocks everything that happens. Appointments to the executive branch, appointments to the judiciary, legislation from the House, it all runs through the Senate. So for people who are watching globally, you need to watch not just the Trump-Biden, not just the bright, shiny object of Trump and his outrages every day, but of course the races in the Senate. The Democrats have a chance to retake the Senate, which would give them potentially the control of all three levers of power, and therefore could produce an avenue for legislation. If the Republicans hold the Senate, there will be gridlock and stasis in many ways, but not in all policy areas, but in some. The thing you have to remember about Joe Biden, who's a fundamentally decent person, and that's why he's leading in the polls, he's what we would call an antidote. He is the vaccine for many people. He's also disorganized, indecisive, and no one alive in the US has lost the presidency more times than Joe Biden has. And so we need to temper our expectations of what a potential defeat of Trump might look like. In addition, the galvanizing of the left that Trump has achieved. Trump has achieved a tremendous political mobilization of the opposite effect. That will be something Biden will have to manage. And we'll see during the campaign, and if he were to win, how he would manage that. So I would say that it's very early to be making conclusions, certainly positive conclusions, although we do see the political vaccine.
So the polling result, by the way, from our audience is something around, it just dropped out of my screen, but it was 47% thought Trump will win, about the balance, 53% thought that the winner will be Biden. A couple of quick questions for you, Stephen. You are an expert on Russia, Stalin and Stalinism. In your discussion of megatrends, you didn't mention Putin, Stalin's successor. Can you comment on Putin's effect on the world, particularly his continuing intervention in Western elections, military interventions in Syria, Ukraine, and others? And I've got three more questions. You've got 2.5 minutes.
The Putin regime has also hit a brick wall. It's also flailing. It has tremendous domestic problems and troubles. His own power is eroding. Once again, this is not about him being overthrown in the near term. Trends continue until there's an alternative. You can't replace something with nothing. And so Putin could go on for some time, but his menace is eroding in terms of his capabilities, not in terms of his behavior necessarily. But the menace that Putin represents does not compare to the challenges that are presented by a US-China mismanaged relationship.
We're now going to a China session. What is the way out for China? Do you see an end game here?
Every communist regime that has fallen has given way to a right-wing, nativist, authoritarian regime. That's true, for example, in Russia. You just mentioned Putin. That's true in all the other Soviet successor states, except for the Baltic states. You see it in Hungary. You see a version of it in Poland. You see it in Serbia. And so China is moving already in that direction inside the Communist Party monopoly. The problem for the Chinese Communist Party is between where it is now and the authoritarian, nationalist, nativist right-wing regime, in the middle is something called Gorbachev. And that's what they don't want to see. They would be maybe happy to go from communist monopoly to remaining in power as a right-wing authoritarian regime, but they don't want to go through the Gorbachev collapse and dislocation, so that's where they hold on. I would like to see an evolution inside the Communist Party regime so that there's a divide between social democrats on the one side and center-right or right-wing authoritarians on the other, so that when we do get beyond the regime at some point, there is a political spectrum of pluralism, not a right-wing authoritarian nativism only.
Well, Stephen Kotkin...
However, the dynamism of the society will continue. Chinese society is breathtaking in its dynamism and entrepreneurialism, and there's no stopping that in the long term. And so all credit to the Chinese for their rise, and let us find a way to manage that.